I want to talk about a moment in military history that fundamentally altered the trajectory of European warfare. This wasn't just another battle in a long series of medieval conflicts. This was a demonstration of how technology, tactics, and circumstances could combine to produce an outcome so shocking that it would reverberate through military thinking for generations. I'm talking about the Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415, in northern France. To understand why this battle matters, we need to back up and get some context. The 100 Years' War had been dragging on for decades at this point. It wasn't really a single war, but rather a series of conflicts between England and France over succession rights, territorial claims, and national pride. By 1415, a young and ambitious English king named Henry V had decided it was time to press England's claims in France with military force. Henry's invasion of France in 1415 was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. He landed with an army and laid siege to the port town of Harfleur. The siege took longer than expected, cost more lives than anticipated, and by the time Harfleur fell, Henry's army was significantly weakened. Disease had ravaged his troops. Dysentery in particular had cut through his ranks like a scythe. Many soldiers were too sick to continue. Others had died. Henry was forced to send many men back to England, either because they were too ill to fight or because he needed to garrison the newly captured town. So here's Henry sitting in northern France with an army that's maybe half the size it was when he started. Winter is approaching. He's deep in enemy territory. The smart move would have been to sail back to England from Harfleur, regroup, and try again next year. But Henry didn't do that. Instead, he decided to march his diminished army overland to Calais, an English-held port further up the coast. From there, he could sail home. It was supposed to be a relatively quick march, maybe 8 days or so. It would demonstrate English strength and allow Henry to save some face after the costly siege. This turned out to be a terrible decision. The French had been assembling their forces, and they weren't about to let Henry just stroll across their territory unchallenged. As the English marched north, the French army shadowed them, growing larger by the day as more nobles and their retinues joined up. The French eventually positioned themselves to block the English route to Calais. The English tried to find a way around, but the French kept cutting them off. This went on for days. The English were running low on supplies. They were exhausted from constant marching. Many were still recovering from illness, and now they were being herded by a much larger French force. Finally, near the village of Agincourt, the French army planted itself directly in the English path. There would be no more running. The English would have to fight their way through or surrender. Let me describe the battlefield itself, because geography played a crucial role in what happened next. The area where the two armies faced each other was a recently plowed field situated between two woods. The field was maybe 1,000 yards wide at its narrowest point. It had been raining, and the freshly turned earth had been transformed into thick, sticky mud, the kind of mud that sucks at your boots and makes every step an effort. This is important. Remember this mud. The English took up position at the southern end of this field. The French arrayed themselves at the northern end, blocking the road to Calais. Both armies could see each other clearly across the muddy expanse. And now we need to talk about the composition of these armies, because that's really the heart of the story. The French had assembled a formidable force. The exact numbers are disputed by historians and probably always will be, but here's what makes sense based on the available evidence. The French had somewhere around 2,400 mounted cavalry. These were knights and men-at-arms, the elite of French society, clad in full plate armor and riding war horses. They also had about 7,600 heavy infantry, again mostly armored men-at-arms who would fight on foot. Additionally, they had roughly 4,000 archers and 1,500 crossbowmen. In total, we're looking at a French force of maybe 15,000 men, give or take. The English army was much smaller and had a very unusual composition. They had no cavalry at all, zero. They had maybe 1,000 heavy infantry, men-at-arms in armor, but the bulk of their army, about 5,000 men, were archers. They had no crossbowmen, so we're looking at an English force of about 6,000 men total. Now I need to emphasize something here. The English didn't plan to have an army that was mostly archers. This wasn't some brilliant strategic decision. It was an accident of attrition. When Henry landed in France, his army was much larger and had normal proportions of different troop types. But disease, casualties from the siege, and the need to garrison Harfleur had whittled down his force. The heavy infantry and cavalry had been hit particularly hard. What was left was this lopsided force that was maybe 80% archers. From a traditional military perspective, this was a disaster. Archers were considered support troops, not your main fighting force. So let's set the scene. It's the morning of October 25th. Both armies are in position. The French are confident. They outnumber the English by maybe 2 or 3 to 1. They have cavalry, which the English don't. They have more armored men-at-arms. They're well supplied and on their home territory. The English are exhausted, hungry, sick, and trapped. On paper, this should be a straightforward French victory. The French deployed in 3 lines. Most of their cavalry was in the front, positioned on the wings. The bulk of their heavy infantry was in the first and second lines. Their archers and crossbowmen were mostly in the third line, held in reserve. This was a fairly traditional deployment. The plan was simple. The cavalry would charge and break the English line, and then the infantry would move in to finish the job. The English, being heavily outnumbered, couldn't afford to deploy in multiple lines. They formed a single line across the narrow field. In the center, they placed all their heavy infantry, their men-at-arms. On the wings, they positioned their archers. They also hid some archers in the woods on both sides of the field. And here's a crucial detail: the English archers deployed wooden stakes in front of their positions. These were sharpened stakes, angled forward, designed to impale charging horses. The archers carried these stakes with them and could set them up relatively quickly. They created a makeshift defensive barrier. Both armies formed up, and then nothing happened. Hours passed. Neither side wanted to make the first move. For the French, waiting made sense. They had reinforcements still arriving. They were comfortable and well supplied. Time was on their side. Every day they waited, the English got weaker and more desperate. For the English, their defensive position was the only advantage they had. Those wooden stakes protected their archers. Moving forward would mean abandoning that protection. But they also couldn't wait forever. Some sources say they were out of food. They were definitely running out of time. If they waited too long, they'd be too weak to fight at all. After several hours of this standoff, Henry made a decision. The English would advance. The archers pulled up their stakes, carried them forward, and the entire army moved closer to the French position. The French just watched this happen. They didn't interfere. Maybe they thought the English were making a mistake by abandoning their position. Maybe they were still content to wait. We'll never know. The English advanced maybe 300 yards and then stopped. The archers replanted their stakes, reconstructing their defensive position. But now they were much closer to the French lines, close enough that the English longbows could reach the French army, and that's when the archers started shooting. Now we need to talk about the English longbow because it was a game changer. The longbow was a relatively recent development in military technology. It was much larger and more powerful than the shortbows that had been common in earlier centuries. An English longbow was typically 6 feet tall, made from yew wood, and required tremendous strength to draw. A trained longbowman could shoot an arrow over 300 yards, and at closer ranges, these arrows could punch through plate armor. The rate of fire was impressive too. A skilled archer could loose maybe 10 arrows per minute. The French started taking arrow fire. At first, it was probably more annoying than dangerous. The range was extreme, but it was enough to force a decision. The French commanders ordered an advance. This is where things started to go wrong for the French. The cavalry on the wings began their charge. These were experienced knights on powerful horses, and they were heading straight for the English archers on the flanks. The archers looked vulnerable. They were lightly armored, armed primarily with bows. In traditional medieval warfare, cavalry would absolutely devastate unprotected archers. The French cavalry probably expected to ride right through them. But as the cavalry charged across that muddy field, the English archers opened up with sustained, rapid fire. Imagine hundreds of arrows filling the air, wave after wave, coming down on the charging cavalry. Horses were hit, riders were hit, but the charge continued. They were committed now. The cavalry reached the English line and ran straight into those defensive stakes. The leading horses impaled themselves on the sharpened poles. They went down, screaming. The horses behind them panicked. Horses are not stupid animals. When they see other horses dying in front of them, they don't want to charge forward. The cavalry charge lost all momentum. Some isolated groups of cavalry managed to engage the archers in hand-to-hand fighting, but most of the cavalry just milled about in front of the English line, unable or unwilling to close the distance, while the archers continued to shoot them at point-blank range. The French cavalry couldn't regroup for another charge. The situation was chaos. Horses were panicking, men were dying, and the whole time arrows kept coming. Finally, the cavalry broke. They turned and fled back toward their own lines, but remember, the French infantry was already advancing. The routing cavalry crashed into their own infantry, causing massive confusion and disorder. Men were knocked down, units lost formation. It was a disaster, and the battle was only minutes old. The French infantry from the first and second lines tried to regroup and continue their advance. These were armored men-at-arms, professional soldiers, the cream of French nobility. They should have been able to handle this. But they were advancing across a muddy field that had just been torn up by hundreds of horses. They were wearing full plate armor, which could weigh 50 pounds or more. Every step was a struggle. The mud sucked at their feet. They sank in with each step. And the entire time, they were under sustained arrow fire from the English longbowmen. The advance took much longer than it should have. The French infantry were exhausted before they even reached the English line. But they were brave and they pressed forward. When they finally reached the English center, they crashed into the English men-at-arms with tremendous force. Now it was hand-to-hand combat, the kind of fighting that medieval warfare was supposed to be about. Armored men hacking at each other with swords, axes, and war hammers. The French still had superior numbers. Even after the losses from the arrow fire, they outnumbered the English heavy infantry significantly. They began to push the English back. The English line was bending. This was the moment where the battle could have turned. If the French could break through the English center, the battle would be over. But the English archers changed the equation. Remember, most of the English army was archers and they were positioned on the flanks. Once the French infantry was engaged with the English center, the archers had perfect targets. They were shooting into the flanks of the French formation at close range. The French were packed together, struggling in the mud, unable to maneuver. The archers couldn't miss. Arrows were punching through armor, finding gaps at joints and visors. French soldiers were falling by the dozens. This fighting went on for hours. It was brutal, exhausting combat. The French kept pushing, kept trying to break through. The English kept holding, kept fighting. As the English archers started to run out of arrows, they dropped their bows, picked up whatever weapons they could find, and joined the melee. The English king, Henry V himself, was in the thick of it. He took an axe blow to his helmet that dented the crown. The English were fighting for their lives. There was no retreat, no surrender. They won or they died. Gradually, the French assault lost steam. They were exhausted. They had taken catastrophic casualties. Their commanders were dead. Finally, some French units began to break. They pulled back. The English immediately pushed forward into the gaps. That was enough. Without leadership, without support, French units began to surrender. Hundreds, then thousands of French soldiers threw down their weapons and gave up. And now the English faced a new problem. They had thousands of prisoners, but they were still facing the uncommitted French third line. They didn't have enough men to guard all these prisoners and still fight. There was a real fear that if the fighting resumed, the prisoners might take up arms again and attack from behind. Henry gave an order that has stained his reputation ever since. The English began executing their prisoners. Thousands of French soldiers who had surrendered were killed. This was a war crime by any standard, medieval or modern. The reasons for it are still debated. Maybe it was a calculated decision to eliminate a threat. Maybe it was meant to intimidate the remaining French forces. Maybe it was just bloodlust and revenge. Whatever the reason, it happened. The French third line, seeing this massacre and recognizing that the battle was lost, withdrew from the field without engaging. The battle was over. The English had won a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. The French lost somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men, including much of their nobility. The English lost maybe 100 to 400 men, depending on which sources you trust. The disparity in casualties was staggering. So what does this battle mean for military history? Why am I spending so much time on it? Because Agincourt demonstrated several trends that would come to define European warfare for the next several centuries. First, it showed the rising importance of projectile weapons. The English longbow was a transitional technology. It wasn't yet a gunpowder weapon, but it pointed toward the future. It had range, it had power, and in sufficient numbers it could dominate a battlefield. Within a few decades, firearms would begin to replace bows, but the principle was the same. Projectile weapons, operated by relatively common soldiers, could defeat armored cavalry and infantry. The age of the armored knight was ending. Second, Agincourt showed that heavy armor had limitations. When you're weighed down with 50 pounds of metal, you can't move quickly. You can't maneuver in difficult terrain. You become a slow-moving target. Going forward, armies would need to balance protection with mobility. Heavy infantry couldn't operate alone anymore. They needed support from projectile troops. Third, the cavalry charge was no longer the decisive trump card it had been for centuries. At Agincourt, the French cavalry charge was turned into a rout without ever really engaging the enemy. The English archers and their defensive stakes had completely neutralized what should have been the French army's greatest advantage. Cavalry would continue to be used for centuries, but never again with the same confidence. Armies would need to be more careful about when and how they deployed their mounted troops. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Agincourt showed that technology and tactics could overcome numerical superiority. The English were outnumbered, exhausted, and trapped. They should have lost. But they had the right technology, the right tactics, and the right terrain. They turned their weaknesses into strengths. This was a lesson that military commanders would study for generations. The battle also had immediate political consequences. The French nobility was devastated. So many nobles died at Agincourt that it created a power vacuum in France. The English victory gave Henry V tremendous prestige and leverage. Within a few years, he would force the French to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which recognized Henry as the heir to the French throne. Of course, Henry died before he could claim that inheritance, and the war continued for decades, but Agincourt changed the dynamic of the conflict. There's one more thing worth mentioning. Agincourt has become legendary not just as a military event, but as a cultural touchstone. Shakespeare wrote about it. The battle has been depicted in films and books. Henry V's speech before the battle, the St. Crispin's Day speech, is one of the most famous passages in English literature, even though Shakespeare invented it decades after the fact. The battle has come to symbolize the idea that determination and courage can overcome impossible odds. Whether that's a fair reading of what actually happened is debatable, but the legend has a life of its own. Looking at Agincourt from our perspective 600 years later, it's easy to see it as inevitable. Of course, the longbow would revolutionize warfare. Of course, heavy cavalry was becoming obsolete. Of course, projectile weapons were the future, but to the people living through it, this was shocking and new. The French had every reason to believe they would win. They had done everything right according to the military wisdom of the time, and they lost catastrophically. That's what makes Agincourt a turning point. It wasn't just a battle. It was a demonstration that the rules of warfare were changing. The medieval period, with its emphasis on armored knights and cavalry charges, was giving way to something new. The early modern period, with its firearms and professional infantry, was beginning to emerge. Agincourt was the moment when that transition became undeniable. The world was changing and there was no going back. Like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.